Picture this. You're walking down a bustling colonial street in 1750, and suddenly you're hit with a wall of, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly Febreze and lavender. The truth about colonial hygiene might actually shock you more than you'd expect, and honestly, it makes our worst hair day seem like a spa retreat. Now, we've all had those moments where we've skipped a shower or two, right? But colonial Americans, they turned avoiding baths into something of an art form. And before you start thinking they were just lazy or didn't care, there's actually a fascinating web of science, religion, and pure survival that shaped how our ancestors approached cleanliness. Here's what's really wild though. Some of their hygiene practices were surprisingly sophisticated, while others were, well, let's say they probably wouldn't pass a modern health inspection. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. The way colonial Americans smelled wasn't just about personal choice. It was literally a matter of life and death, social status, and believe it or not, religious salvation. So buckle up, because we're about to dive nose first into the aromatic world of colonial America. And trust me, you'll never look at your morning shower the same way again. Let's start with something that might seem obvious: bathing. Except in colonial America, taking a full body bath was about as common as finding a Starbucks on every corner. Which is to say, it basically didn't happen. Now you might be thinking, come on, they had to bathe sometimes, right? Well, here's where it gets interesting. Full body baths were typically reserved for infants, and even then, it wasn't really about getting them clean. Colonial parents believed that dunking babies in water would somehow toughen them up against diseases. It was like an early version of cold therapy, except with way more crying and significantly less scientific backing. For everyone else, they just washed, sort of. Each morning, if you were lucky, you might rinse your face and hands with a cloth using a basin. That's it. That was your entire hygiene routine. And soap? That was considered a luxury item that most people couldn't afford or simply didn't bother with. But here's what's fascinating. This wasn't necessarily because colonial Americans were dirty people who didn't care about cleanliness. There were actually some pretty compelling reasons behind their bathing habits, or lack thereof. First off, water was often contaminated. Without modern filtration systems, taking a bath in questionable water could literally kill you. Dysentery, typhoid fever, and cholera were all lurking in colonial water sources, just waiting for someone to take a nice, relaxing soak. So in a weird way, avoiding baths might have actually saved lives. Then there was the practical side of things. Heating enough water for a full bath required a tremendous amount of fuel and time. We're talking about hauling water from wells or streams, chopping wood, building fires, and waiting hours for enough water to heat up. When you're already working from dawn to dusk just to survive, spending half your day preparing for a bath probably seemed like a pretty poor use of time. And if you were wealthy enough to afford a bathtub, well, congratulations. You got a tub that was barely big enough for what we'd call a sponge bath today. Even the rich weren't exactly living it up in luxurious soaking tubs. So what did colonial Americans actually smell like? Well, imagine if you took the scent of unwashed wool, mixed it with wood smoke, added a generous helping of animal odors, and topped it off with whatever your last meal was. Now multiply that by about 3 months without a proper wash and you're getting close. But here's where it gets really interesting. Different social classes had distinctly different odors, and people could literally smell your status from across the room. The wealthy might have smelled like imported European soaps and expensive fragrances mixed with the pomade they used to style their elaborate wigs. But even their fancy scents couldn't completely mask the underlying aroma of rarely washed bodies and clothes that were cleaned maybe once a month if they were lucky. The middle class? They probably smelled like lye soap, a harsh, chemical-scented concoction made from ash and animal fat that was so strong it could practically strip paint. This soap was mainly used for cleaning dishes and clothes, not bodies, but the smell would cling to everything. And the poor? Well, they smelled like survival. Wood smoke from cooking fires, the animals they lived alongside, and the honest sweat of hard physical labor. But here's something that might surprise you. They might have actually been healthier than their wealthier counterparts in some ways because they were more likely to work outdoors and get fresh air. Speaking of animals, let's talk about one of the most distinctive aspects of colonial odor. The fact that people and livestock often shared living spaces. During harsh winters, families would bring their cows, pigs, and chickens inside for warmth. Imagine trying to sleep while sharing your bedroom with a cow. The smell alone would probably keep you awake, but somehow colonial families made it work. Now, if you really want to understand colonial hygiene, we need to talk about wigs, because nothing says, I care about my appearance, quite like shaving off all your hair and wearing someone else's instead. Powdered wigs were absolutely everywhere among the middle and upper classes. Both men and women wore them, and they kept their own hair cropped extremely short underneath. Why? One word: lice. Lice infestations were so common that people just accepted them as a fact of life. Shaving your head was the most effective way to prevent these tiny hitchhikers from setting up permanent residence in your hair. But here's the ironic part. The wigs themselves were just as prone to lice infestations as natural hair. So what did a wig smell like? Well, imagine wet sheep mixed with whatever fragrance they used to try to mask the odor. Wig maintenance involved boiling the hairpiece to kill lice, then dousing it in fragrances like sassafras, bergamot, and bay leaves. The result was probably something like a barnyard that had been attacked by a perfume factory. But wait, it gets better. The pomade used to style these wigs actually attracted insects. So you had people wearing dead hair, treated with bug-killing chemicals, scented with herbs, and styled with products that basically sent out dinner invitations to every fly and mosquito in the neighborhood. The whole system was, as one might say, a bit wiggity whack. Here's where colonial hygiene gets really fascinating. It wasn't just about practical concerns. For many colonists, cleanliness was literally a moral issue tied directly to their relationship with God. The Puritans in particular saw a direct connection between spiritual health and physical cleanliness. They believed that keeping your body, clothes, home, and town clean was actually a form of worship. To them, being dirty wasn't just unpleasant, it was sinful. They associated poor hygiene with the sin of sloth, and believed that clean people were less likely to engage in other sins and less likely to be poor. But here's the catch. This only applied to private bathing. Public bathing was seen as morally dangerous and likely to lead to sexual impropriety and disease. So you were supposed to be clean, but only in the privacy of your own home, and definitely not in any way that might be considered enjoyable or social. Water itself was considered purifying and capable of cleansing not just the body, but the mind and soul as well. This created an interesting tension between the practical difficulties of staying clean and the religious imperative to do so. If you think colonial body odor was bad, wait until you hear about their breath. Dental hygiene in the 17th and 18th centuries was, to put it mildly, not a priority. Toothaches were incredibly common, and the first line of defense was usually natural remedies like chamomile or figs. If that didn't work, people might turn to alcohol or even opium as painkillers. But when a tooth really needed to come out, you didn't go to a dentist, you went to whoever had the strongest hands and the sharpest tools. Usually that meant a blacksmith, barber, or apothecary. Here's something that'll make you appreciate modern dentistry. Sometimes, after pulling a tooth, they would simply try to shove it back into the socket, hoping it would somehow reattach itself. More commonly though, people would get dentures made from wood, ivory, metal, or even teeth, purchased from poor people who were desperate enough to sell them. George Washington, of course, was the most famous wearer of false teeth from this period. Contrary to popular belief, his dentures weren't made of wood. They were crafted from metal, wire, and animal teeth, and they were apparently so painful that they distorted the shape of his face. Imagine trying to give inspiring speeches to rally the troops while your mouth is full of uncomfortable animal teeth. That's dedication to the cause right there. One of the most fascinating aspects of colonial hygiene was how smell became a marker of social class and moral character. The wealthy could afford imported soaps and fragrances from Europe, which set them apart from the masses who had to make do with harsh lye soap or no soap at all. But even among the wealthy, there were hierarchies of scent. The truly elite might smell like expensive French perfumes and fine soaps, while the merely well-off might smell like locally made fragrances and domestic soap products. For women, the situation was particularly complex. Cleanliness was expected and morally important, but too much attention to personal hygiene could be seen as vanity or even sexual impropriety. There was a delicate balance between being clean enough to be respectable and being so clean that people questioned your moral character. Interestingly, some doctors of the time actually theorized that women could control their attractiveness through their scent. Dr. Thomas Ewell of Virginia suggested that women use smell as a defense mechanism, making themselves as disgusting as possible to ward off unwanted male attention. Whether this was actually true or just the theory of a doctor who probably didn't have many female patients is up for debate. The challenges of staying clean became even more pronounced during times of war. George Washington was acutely aware that disease posed a greater threat to his Continental Army than British bullets did. He issued specific orders requiring his soldiers to wash their hands and faces once a day and change their shirts once a week. But here's the reality. Most soldiers completely ignored these orders. One witness recorded that the troops were not used to doing things of this sort and would sooner let their clothes rot on their backs than wash them for themselves. This created a need for what were called followers, men, women, and children who traveled with the army to cook, clean, and maintain basic hygiene standards. These unsung heroes of the American Revolution were literally keeping our founding fathers from dying of preventable diseases. The irony is that while poor sanitation killed about 2/3 of Washington's troops at Valley Forge, it also worked in America's favor when British troops in the South were decimated by various fevers and diseases they encountered in the unfamiliar climate. What's really interesting is that colonial Americans weren't entirely wrong about some of their hygiene practices, even if they didn't understand the science behind them. For example, the practice of not washing wool clothing too frequently actually made sense. Wool contains natural lanolin, which acts as a waterproofing agent. Washing removes this protective coating, making the clothing less effective at keeping out moisture and cold. So while unwashed wool clothing might have smelled terrible, it was actually more functional than clean wool. Similarly, the herbs and fragrances used in wig care, sassafras, bergamot, and bay leaves, do have natural insect-repelling properties. Colonial Americans might not have understood the chemistry, but they had figured out through trial and error that these scents help keep bugs away. Even some of their more unusual practices had practical benefits. Earwax, for instance, was considered valuable because it could be used to keep thread from unraveling when beeswax wasn't available. So those silver ear picks found in archaeological digs weren't just hygiene tools. They were practical implements for daily life. To really understand what colonial America smelled like, you have to imagine an entire sensory landscape that's completely foreign to our modern experience. Cities and towns were filled with the smells of wood smoke, animal waste, rotting garbage, and unwashed bodies. But mixed in with these less pleasant odors were the scents of herbs, spices, cooking food, and the natural world. Streets were often clogged with garbage and animal feces, creating a constant background aroma that would probably send modern city dwellers running for the hills. Outhouses were typically located close to water sources, which meant that the smell of human waste was never far away. But there were pleasant smells too. Bakeries filled the air with the scent of fresh bread. Herb gardens provided aromatic relief from less pleasant odors. And the smoke from countless fireplaces created a distinctive woody smell that would have been as characteristic of colonial towns as car exhaust is of modern cities. The smell of colonial America also changed dramatically with the seasons. Summer brought intensified body odors as people sweated in heavy clothing they rarely washed. The heat also made garbage and waste smell worse, and increased the activity of insects that added their own contributions to the aromatic landscape. Winter, on the other hand, brought the smells of wood smoke and indoor living. When families brought their animals inside for warmth, homes would fill with the scents of livestock mixed with cooking food and unwashed bodies. It was probably overwhelming at first, but people adapted to these smells just as we adapt to the background noise of modern life. Spring meant cleaning, the one time of year when people might actually wash their clothes and air out their homes. The smell of lye soap and wet wool would fill the air as families tried to refresh their belongings after a long winter of indoor living. Looking back at colonial hygiene practices, it's easy to judge our ancestors for their apparent lack of cleanliness. But the reality is that they were making rational decisions based on the knowledge, resources, and circumstances available to them. Their approach to hygiene was shaped by practical concerns about water safety, fuel conservation, and time management. It was influenced by religious beliefs about morality and cleanliness. And it was constrained by the simple reality that staying clean required enormous amounts of time, energy, and resources that most people simply didn't have. In many ways, colonial Americans were remarkably resourceful in their approach to hygiene. They found ways to stay relatively clean and healthy despite enormous challenges. They developed soap-making techniques, herbal remedies, and practical solutions that allowed them to survive and thrive in a world without modern conveniences. And perhaps most importantly, they created communities where people looked out for each other's health and well-being. The followers who traveled with the Continental Army, the neighbors who shared soap-making knowledge, and the families who worked together to maintain basic cleanliness standards all contributed to a social fabric that prioritized collective survival over individual comfort. So what did people smell like in colonial America? The answer is complex, varied, and probably more interesting than you might have expected. They smelled like survival, like community, like the natural world they lived so closely with. They smelled like wood smoke and wool, like herbs and animals, like honest work and practical compromises. But most of all, they smelled human. In a world without artificial fragrances and chemical cleaners, people smelled like themselves, for better or worse. And while we might not want to go back to those aromatic days, there's something to be said for a time when people's scents told the story of their lives, their work, and their place in the world. The next time you step out of a hot shower, reach for your deodorant, or brush your teeth with fluoride toothpaste, take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come. But also remember that our colonial ancestors weren't so different from us. They were just doing their best to stay clean, healthy, and respectable in a world that made all of those things incredibly challenging. And who knows, maybe there's something we can learn from their resourcefulness, their community spirit, and their ability to find practical solutions to everyday problems. After all, they managed to build a nation while smelling like, well, let's just say they had other priorities. If you found these colonial hygiene secrets as fascinating as I did, make sure to subscribe for more eye-opening stories about what life was really like in colonial America. Because trust me, we've only scratched the surface of how different things were back then, and I'm curious, after learning about all these colonial smells and hygiene practices, which one shocked you the most? Was it the animal teeth dentures, the shared living spaces with livestock, or maybe those lice-infested wigs? Drop a comment below and let me know what you think would have been the hardest part about colonial hygiene to deal with. I'll see you in the next one.